Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 39, Bigfoot Blues. Stockton Street was a well-heeled avenue. It took in posh shops in Union Square, colourful cuisine in Chinatown, and then led north to end in seafood delights at Fisherman's Wharf. Martin stood towards its southern end, outside the 4-star Hyatt Hotel, smoking a cigarette. He watched a long, sleek, bright red fire truck flash by. Passing pedestrians stared at the raggle-taggle group of people he belonged to. They had a jumble of suitcases piled up on the pavement. It was early August. The freeloaders were in San Francisco. Frankie was back in town. It was midday local time. Martin had made it back to the States for his third visit. Richie swept the tour party off the sidewalk and into reception. Martin got his key. He found his room, threw his stuff down, and crashed out on the bed. When he woke up again, it was getting dark. He guessed it was early evening. His stomach was grumbling. Martin headed down to reception and asked where he could eat nearby. They assured him the hotel restaurant was very good. Martin wanted a change of scenery. He went out and turned left. As luck would have it, just 2 blocks down, there was a corner pub. He could hear live jazz. As he got closer, he could also smell food. Perfect. Martin went in and spotted an empty table near the band. The menu was simple fare. Martin ordered a burger and a beer. The band were really good. It was nice to be so close up in a small room. What a change from all those overblown, monster-sized gigs he'd been playing. The food arrived swiftly. Martin tucked in with relish. He tried to savour the moment too. Eating a real burger in San Francisco, drinking cold bud and watching live jazz. Martin stood staring at the bright turquoise house front. He was fascinated by the complicated carving around the upper windows, the gingerbread decoration under their gable roofs. The building still recalled the turn of the 20th century. A few doors down was a magnificent Queen Anne mansion in red, gold and white. It had a corner turret with all-round bay windows. Martin was on Haight Street. He wondered what had happened to all that love and peace. He'd really been too young to get that whole hippie thing. He just thought it was cool. Martin tried to imagine what this place had been like back then. The houses had hardly changed. Further west, residential Haight Street morphed into an endless series of organic health food cafes, esoteric bookshops, retro boutiques, smoke shops, and garish, tacky hippie emporiums. All you need is cash. He was driven out of a coffee bar by a neo-hippie chick. She was holding forth at runway volume in vowel-twisting valley girl slang. She only had 2 adjectives, awesome or just so gross. Martin took refuge in the small music shop next door and tried out a nice second-hand Fender guitar. A California girl with a baseball cap sprouting bright blue dreadlocks was sitting cross-legged on the pavement. She was strumming a gaily painted acoustic guitar. It was a James Taylor song she'd probably learnt from her dad's vinyl collection. Martin remembered it from his lovesick teenage years. She was really pretty. Brown wind cheater, army-style trousers and charity shop scarf. Her 2 heavily tattooed male companions wore painful piercings. Just down the street there was a cluster of metal signs. Subway, Texaco, and guns. Martin was in Humboldt County, a couple of 100 miles north up the coast from San Francisco. They'd crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and cruised north along miles and miles of dusty highway. Their bus driver had navigated long, winding stretches of road through thick forest, with sheer drops and treacherous bends above the glistening Eel River. This was Bigfoot country, the land of the giant redwood and giant footprints. Frankie and the band were headlining on the last day of the annual reggae festival held on the river's banks. Martin sat in the back of the minivan watching the redwoods go by and listening to their chauffeurs tell them how excited a lot of people were to get to see Frankie live. They'd been waiting all day. Their backstage tent had been lovingly decorated inside and out with colourful fabrics. A Persian carpet scattered with cushions covered the floor. There was a plastic tub filled with ice and cans of red Stripe. In the middle was a table with snacks, pride of place taken by a generously heaped bowl of finest buds of California weed. Martin swiftly grabbed a handful before it disappeared. Looking out from the stage, a searchlight from the back of the crowd caught the thick pall of weed smoke and dust hanging over the crowd. Around 10,000 people had gathered to watch Frankie and the band. Flags of many nations, including the Rasta red, gold and green, waved high above their heads. Thick forest and steep tree-lined rocky slopes surrounded them. The smell of weed, barbecue and patchouli was almost overwhelming. The crowd gave Frankie a hero's welcome. They glowed with energy and good vibes. The freeloaders only had 90 minutes to work their magic. Martin felt it fly by. All too soon, they filed off the stage with a last wave. Frankie closed the show with his ritual solo a cappella. After a few beers in the backstage tent, the band was shuttled back to small-town tranquility, tired but happy. Martin sat alone in his tacky but comfortable motel suite, rolling a larger-than-life goodnight spliff. He smoked half of it and stretched his legs out along the sofa. It wasn't worth going to bed. He set his travel alarm for 6 a.m. and drifted into oblivion. The cathedral still looked dark and dirty in places with the sun behind it. They'd cleaned off quite a bit of the soot and pigeon shit since Martin had first seen it. In a way, it seemed like things had come full circle since then. This was the very first sight that had greeted him when he'd come to Cologne that first time. He saw it every day for years when he started teaching. Now here he was again. Things looked different from a massive 15-foot-high stage. It overlooked the square in front of the cathedral. About 12,000 people would be coming to watch Frankie and the band that evening. Martin wasn't in a good mood. The thrill had gone, as B.B. King had put it. They'd had another busy year, and they'd certainly got around. As well as conquering most of Europe yet again, they'd been to Greece for the first time, and to Serbia and Hungary again, not forgetting California. To make all this possible, at the beginning of the year, they'd had to compromise. Martin and the band had been forced to take a considerable cut in gig fees. The bloated multi-truck autumn tour had lost money hand over fist. The tour balance sheet had been looking grim. They could all just have said no and quit. No one did, of course. Martin had signed up for another year. He feared the gaping hole it would leave in his life if he stopped. He took his slice of the humble pie and tried not to choke on it. Martin looked out that night over the enormous crowd with the cathedral in the background. He felt a mixture of pride, joy, and sadness. The band were on fine form after several days' rehearsals, but Frankie sounded way off key way too often. Martin shook his head a couple of times. He hoped no one had noticed. He had a feeling this was all coming to an end. Maybe this was as far as it was meant to go. Stockholm. It was grey and rainy up north. The tarmac in front of the stage was glistening wet, covered in puddles. Soggy sound check. A few people stood forlornly waiting for the band to play something. Behind them, the fairground rides whizzed and whirled in garish neon colours. Coloured lights blinked and flashed. The roller coaster soared and the octopus jerked giddily round. It took Martin back to when he was a kid. The smell of popcorn, hot dogs and greasy fried onions. Pop music pumping out of the speaker at a volume you couldn't experience elsewhere. It was a long way to come for just one gig. Everything was covered in polythene sheets and the stage had an inch or so of water on it. Water and electricity don't mix. Martin was glad he had wireless. It was the last date on the calendar for that year. When stage time came around, he was feeling thoroughly relaxed. Martin actually enjoyed himself once the rain stopped. The crowd overcame their Scandinavian cool and danced in the puddles. The band came round to his hotel room afterwards for a little end-of-year party. As always, he was the only one who had something to play music on. Andy and Anna were the last to leave. Out of all the band, they were the closest. He'd miss them.